everybody, and welcome to the music rating, ranking, and reviewing podcast that we like to call Music Meltdown, which we rate, rank, and review an artist's discography, songs, whatever musical topic, perhaps non-musical topic, that I really feel like getting into. This episode, I'm joined with former guest Vanessa Picard. I believe is how you say your last name.
Yeah.
Hey, cool. Didn't mess that up. Cool. But yeah, we're going to be tackling an artist from her neck of the woods, which is far above me, coming from Nova Scotia, more specifically Halifax, the power pop. How's the name for a group of four people? I'm blanking. Who cares?
Quartet?
Yeah, quartet. We'll go with that. Talking about Sloan, power pop band that's gone through a lot of different styles. I guess the best way for me to describe them in the current moment, kind of like you take a harder rock band, say like the harder elements like an AC/DC or a Rush, and mix that in with like a Cheap Trick and a Big Star with a ton of Beatlesque melodies, and that's kind of, I guess, the best way I can describe Sloan as. But there's a ton of different variation in this discography.
Yeah.
Probably the most interesting thing about them is that all four of the lead members write and sing upon all of the records, except for Action Packed. For some reason, there wasn't an Andrew song on that one. But yeah, it's an interesting group to discuss because of that. They have 13 studio records, so we're just going to kick this out by going 13, 12, and 11 at the top, and then we'll do one by one on the top 10. And I figure I'll get into my familiarity with Sloan now. I knew two records going into this. I knew Never Hear the End of It because I did Album of the Year Ranked a while ago, and I liked that a fair bit. And for last year, because I was trying to listen to more new music, I listened to their newest record, Steady, which I also really enjoyed. Past that, I knew some songs because there's a separate thing on the Taste Like Music Discord server called Camp. It's like a music-related game. And I hosted the first season of that, in which one of the Taste Like Music primary members, Jason, played as Sloan. He ended up getting runner-up that season, and I found myself very interested in Sloan. Funnily enough, he lost to Vanessa as Smiths. So funny how that comes full circle.
Yeah.
But yeah, I knew a little bit about Sloan. I was interested in their catalog, but I suspect you knew a fair bit more than me, given
Oh yeah. Yeah.
they actually had radio play for you.
Oh yeah, they're huge here. Well, especially in Halifax. I mean, they're from here. They're hometown boys. So even their new songs from the latest album get play on the radio. So I knew all the singles very well. The first time I probably heard them and was aware of them would have been in 1996 when One Chord to Another came out, and The Good in Everyone was a huge Much Music hit, and that was where I got most of my music at that time. So I loved that song. They played that video all the time, and a couple other songs from that album. So then from there, they were pretty big for a while, like in the late 90s, early 2000s to mid 2000s, especially. Like they had hit after hit after hit. So they had big music videos and big radio hits. And I was familiar with a lot of the albums from that time period and like the first two albums, but I didn't really hear much past Action Packed other than the new one. Like I just hadn't, for whatever reason, I just lost track of their new albums. And that was kind of when they stopped having as many hits too, that I noticed. So there was some new stuff in here for me, but I was pretty well familiar with a lot of it too.
Nice. It kind of makes sense they would start getting less hits around the time after Action Pack, given the next record was Never Hear the End of It, which definitely has less radio-ready songs, I would say. And then the later records, we'll get into that. I'm gonna go ahead and kick things off, just kind of because I have a feeling you're gonna like this more than me. But I'll preface this by saying I liked Sloan. I found this to be an enjoyable experience. The issue is, as you maybe saw in the Big Star video, and I guess a little bit in some other ones, I'm just not the biggest fan of power pop. It's a good genre, but I feel like I'm kind of one of those people who often takes it for granted. Like, I think that it's good, but very rarely is it like one of my favorites. With that being said, though, at the dead bottom for me, I'm going with the debut record Smeared. I don't think that this is a bad album, but it's very clear that they weren't really sure what their identity was supposed to be. On this record, it almost has tinges of shoegaze at points, and it's just not that great of a sound that I feel that complements the writing. None of the songs here are bad, but they just kind of feel out of place with the group. The highlights for me would be Take It In as well as 500 Up. But it's a far cry from the power pop that they'd be making on future records, and I have that at 2.5. And it's sort of something I'm going to do with all of these records. I'm going to note like my favorite song and who wrote it because I find that interesting. On here, it was 500 Up, written by Andrew.
Hmm.
Following this, I have a feeling you might have this one a little bit higher. I know Jason really likes this record, but I'm going to be talking about Parallel Play. Maybe it's just me, but I just don't find a lot in this run. At many points, it just felt kind of stuck. I feel like sometimes after some of their more experimental records, like for example, Never Hear the End of It and Commonwealth, they kind of follow it with a bit of a generic record for them, you could say. And I feel like this is probably the worst example of that, where it's just a bunch of fun, quick, and to the point power pop songs. And I think if you love the style, this could be one of the better ones. But for me, it's just not my favorite thing. And I feel like what they were doing before this is maybe a bit more interesting. Despite that, there is a couple of good cuts, my favorite of which being Cheap Champagne by Jay. All in all, it's not very remarkable. It's 3 stars for me. It's a decent record, but I don't love it. At number 11, I know that Canadian press loves this record. Maybe this is a bit contentious, but I have Twice Removed. This is a little bit closer to the classic Sloan sound. It's a lot less noisy, a generally more light-hearted record, really embracing a lot of the power pop that they'd later be known for, but I still don't think it's quite there. The guitars are maybe a tad noisier than they should be, and the hooks aren't necessarily as strong as they would be on the record following this. But it kind of does work as a bit of a middle ground. Some of my favorites here were Coax Me, Bells On, and Swimsuit Sound. Unfortunately, the thing that does leave this record at 3 stars, however, is I didn't much care for the longer songs here. I didn't think Loosens or Before I Do were all that good. It's a bit too inconsistent for me to go above 3 stars, but the good songs here are pretty good, with my favorite one being Coax Me by Chris. And those are my bottom 3 records. Overall, nothing terrible in this discography, but I do feel like there is definitely some room to grow from here. So,
All right. Well, I will preface by saying I don't think they have any actually bad albums. Some that are not as good, obviously, and I kind of stay at the same rating for a little while, but there's kind of different tiers of that rating. So at my bottom, it's a different one. You haven't mentioned it yet, but my number 13 is number 12, which I just, it's a good album. But I feel like it's where they're really just leaning into their sound that they'd established at that point. And like I don't barely remember the songs from it. Like it's one rare case where I can say like I don't have major standouts from it. I'd say like it's pleasant. I enjoyed it. I would listen to it again, but I'm not gonna say, oh yeah, that's my go-to Sloan record. Like I don't know. They kind of were just leaning into the formula at that point, I think. So that's why it's my bottom, but it's still a 3.5. I still think it's good, but it's just not my favorite. I know they're capable of better. So that really is what brings it down. And my number 12 is Smeared. I agree. Like they hadn't found their sound here. They're doing something totally different than what they would end up doing. We see a few hints of what they would do later. Like Underwhelmed is a huge song here in Canada. And when they played it at the show, when I saw them actually a few weeks ago, people lost their minds. Like that song is huge here. So that's how they start the album. And then it kind of goes downhill from there, I think, because that's really like the highlight. And 500 Up was another single, and that is another highlight. But from there, I don't know. Like I have a few others that I put down, like Sugar Tune by Patrick. That's a good one, kind of closer to a power pop kind of thing. And I liked I Am the Cancer with the female backing vocals, featuring Jennifer Pierce from Jail, who was another band from the Halifax scene at the time, who was very closely tied to Sloan. As well, like I just thought it was mostly just a shoegaze kind of inspired sound with a lot of Sonic Youth inspiration. Like there was one song, Two Seater, written by Chris, which just reminded me so much of Silver Rocket by Sonic Youth. It just, yeah. So I don't like, if this is what they kept doing, we wouldn't even be talking about them right now. Because not that it's bad, it's just not very distinctive. So that's also a 3.5 for me as well. I mean, like it's still an enjoyable listen. And my number 11 is The Double Cross, which kind of is in a similar vein to 12. I just, not a lot of standouts on it to me. It's them leaning into that established sound, I think. And it's good. I enjoy it. I do have a few more highlights that I took down on this one. Jay's "The Answer Was You." That's a nice, sweet Jay song. I always love a good, sweet Jay song. "Shadow of Love" by Chris. That was a cool one. A little more of a 70s power pop vibe. I also like Green Gardens Cold Montreal by Jay. Had a good acoustic sound. And Beverly Terrace. So he was kind of like the one who really stood out on this album, but still, it's just it's good. It's just not up there with some of the best for me. So that's another 3.5, number 11.
Interesting. Yeah, generally that was all right. I do disagree on Double Cross. That'll come later. However, I think that we have a pretty similar opinion on it for what it's worth. Top 10 now, and I'm talking about 12. It's a solid record, although I feel like there isn't a ton to really grab onto here. There's nothing bad, and generally the songs are all pretty solid, but none really come all that close to being one of my favorite Sloan songs. Jay's "The Lion's Share" would probably come the closest, and there's just not a ton to say about it. It's good, it's a solid power pop album, but as I'm probably going to repeat over and over, I just don't love power pop. It's a low 3.5 stars for me. I do think that they have 10 records that I call genuinely good. However, I don't know how many of them I would necessarily reach for. So number 10, 12.
Right, my number 10 is also the one that the Canadian press loves for some unknown reason. I've looked at multiple lists and this was always near the top and I don't understand. And that's Twice Removed. Actually, I own it and I own Smeared because those are the ones that everyone says you got to get, but I've just never thought they were that great. This one is very front loaded, I think. There's a lot of good songs at the beginning. I really like the first bunch of songs, Pen Pals, with the interesting lyrics that they actually took from actual letters to Nirvana that they found around Geffen's offices. So that's where the lyrics to that one come from. I Hate My Generation. That's a cool song. People of the Sky. That's great, very catchy, and also was a single as well as Coax Me. Coax Me is probably the biggest song off this album that's endured and lived on, like you still hear it. I like Bells On. I thought that was a cool song, but then that's where the album kind of loses its ground for me and goes into a bunch of songs that I'm just not super into. Like I really Shame, not big on that one at all. Just got kind of a generic kind of 90s sound. Snowsuit Sound and I Can Feel It were the two highlights of the second half, I thought. Liked those two. And once again, Jennifer Pierce shows up on backing vocals on I Can Feel It, which it was a nice touch. But I think after this album, they fell out with them. So she never appears again. But yeah, I just don't get why this would be what anyone would consider their peak because they're just starting to kind of find their sound in parts of it, but they still haven't quite got there. They can do so much better and we will see them do so much better. So it can't be anywhere above number 10, I would say. And even that, I questioned if that was too high, to be honest, but it's just how it worked out. So 3.5 for that one as well.
Yep, glad we're seeing pretty eye to eye on that one. It's good, it's fine. But like I showed you before, there was that list of like top 100 Canadian albums of all time. And it had it at like number 40 as their best record.
Yeah.
It's just like, come on, no.
And that's not the only instance of that. I found multiple lists online that were all Canadian based, and it was always in the top 5, if not top 3, which is insane.
I get top 5. It's an interesting record for them, but it's not really them based on the rest of the discography.
Yeah. It's nostalgia, I think. I think
Probably.
That's where they hit big here and people were excited about it. And I think some of that ties into a nostalgic feeling. And maybe some of these people aren't as familiar with the later records, or I don't know. But perhaps. I just disagree with that opinion very much so. Yeah.
Well, next up for me at my number 9, not sure how this record's going to play for you. I have Pretty Together. I don't think it's a bad album, but I do think it's a bit disappointing following Between the Bridges. For starters, I don't love the sound of it. The same thing kind of goes for Action Packed. Notably in the opener, if it feels Do It Good, it just seems a lot louder, which I know I sound like this whole like woman or whatever just being crazy, like you're too loud. But no, I just don't think that necessarily fits them as well. I prefer them being in the more pop vein instead of, I prefer them emphasizing the pop as opposed to the power, I guess is the best way of putting it. Moving on there is also a bit of almost trip hop influences on the back half of the record, and I like them. I don't think that they fit into the Sloan sound very well, though, despite that. There are still some really good songs on this record. In the Movies is one of the better straightforward power pop tunes. Same thing goes for The Other Man. My favorite songs were those slightly trip hop influenced songs I was saying near the back end with Are You Giving Are You Giving Me Back Your Love, as well as Your Dreams Have Come True. Despite that, I do feel a bit of disappointment after Between the Bridges. I think that this is a pretty notable step down. And I wouldn't say that this record, like 12, has any of like my favorite Sloan songs. It's still good. I have it at 3.5 stars. And my favorite song was Are You Giving Me Back Your Love by Jay. But for me, it's just not anywhere near one of their best. So number 9.
Interesting. That actually had 2 big hits on it. And If It Feels Good, Do It is one of them, and The Other Man was the other. So yeah, heard those songs a lot. So my number 9 is Parallel Play, which I think probably could use some more time. Like some of these later ones, I just wasn't as familiar with. So I think that maybe if I had more time with them, they would be higher later on. But this is where they land right now. I do think it's another case where it's stronger in the first half than the second. But there were some highlights in the second half, like Down in the Basement, The Other Side, Living the Dream. Just a few more songs that just didn't stand out as much as the ones at the beginning of the album. And like all of it's solid and enjoyable. Like at no point do I think any of these albums are really bad. So like it's still a good album. And it's kind of just one I found a little difficult to place more than anything. I agree that Cheap Champagne is a highlight for sure. It's definitely one of the best songs. And then I like All I Am Is All You're Not, in Emergency 911, Witch's Wand. Like lots of great songs on here, but still a high 3.5, much higher than I would say that Twice Removed did. So
Nice. Unfortunately, neither of us brought up one of the best songs on that record, Chester the Molester, but I guess we can move past that one. That was on
well,
Paramount.
that's on Navy Blues.
Oh, really? I thought
Yeah.
that was.
No.
Well, let's rebound because I'm talking about Navy Blues now. Sadly, a bit of a regression from one chord to another for me. They're still very much in the power pop style, but I feel like they're almost a bit too clean cut across this record. It feels pretty infectious, notably on songs like Iggy and Angus, as well as Sinking Ships. Despite that, there are some really excellent left turns, notably the closing 2 songs, I Want to Thank You and I'm Not Through With You Yet. But there are plenty of great pop numbers as well. Come On is great, same with Keep On Thinking and the aforementioned song that I thought was on a different record, Chester the Molester. To me, though, I don't know. I didn't mark the songs I was less high on, but I do think that this one's a bit inconsistent and something that you may have picked up on in the McCartney episode. Vanessa won't because that's still not out yet. Sometimes music is just too happy for me. I'm just too much of a pessimist for my own good. And this record at points is maybe the one where I got a little bit too much of that. Just a bit too happy-go-lucky, I suppose. Still have it at 3.5 stars. I think it's a good record. My favorite song being I Want to Thank You by Jay. Get used to me saying Jay has the best songs on these records. But yeah, I don't know. I've heard a lot of good things about that one, and it's good, just not one of their best, in my opinion. So number 8, Navy Blues.
That's another one that gets a lot of love from the Canadian press and just in general. But I'll get into it in a bit. My next one is Commonwealth, which I thought was a cool album. I really like that they did this. It's really them stretching out and doing something very different. And the idea of giving each of them a side was a cool thing. And I mean, it's actually, I'm going into a new level of grading, so it's still a really good album for me. And despite the fact that it's a double album, I think that the element of them each having their own side keeps it interesting, keeps it engaging the entire time. I'd say that Jay's side is my favorite because it's basically like a complete album within a tiny little album. Like he catches every emotion, he brings it's just perfect from beginning to end in his part. And I'd say that Patrick's probably my second favorite side. Although he has one experimental song on there that's quite different, that is more probably interesting than it is something that I really loved, which would have been that What's Inside song, which is very drony, spacey, swirly, something we've never really heard him do before, which is awesome because he does tend to fall into a very similar style of writing. But probably not my favorite song, but I appreciated that he did it. Chris's side also really, really positive, really good for me. I liked lots of great melodies, lots of great songs as usual. Andrew's was probably the most challenging, but also still very cool. The fact that he had like one 17-minute song was a cool thing. The beginning of it, I was like for those first couple minutes, the dog barking and the noise, and I thought, oh my gosh, is this ever going to stop? And then finally, it just kicked into the song, like when I started to feel that way. So that's good. And there's lots of twists and turns. It's very engaging. It's cool. So yeah, I think it's definitely a cool album. It was a pleasant surprise. I wasn't really sure what to expect from it, especially just given the whole concept and just the approach. But I think it's a really good album, especially at that point in their career. It's cool that they did something like that. So it is a 4-star album for me. I do think that even with them all having their own side, it still fit together. It's not choppy. They're making their own statement, but it's all working together. It's all cohesive. So that's pretty hard to do, but I think they pull it off.
Absolutely.
I've seen ranking with that one at the bottom, actually, which
is bizarre. I know
yeah.
Jason had it like second. I think third to the bottom. Because
Oh,
I think he
really?
had the first to it for last spot. I watched his video like 3 times in preparation for this, and I can never remember his list because it's bizarre. But
I didn't actually watch it because I'm going to watch it after.
not nice. His number one is the obvious one, knowing him. So, and I'll say one thing before I get to that record, which it's not my next one, but interesting that you point out Patrick's side because I think that his is probably the weakest of all of them, aside from What's Inside. I think that song's awesome.
Oh,
I guess that makes more sense given my taste, though, but
yeah.
it is what it is. What are we on now? Number 7?
Yes.
All right. Number 7 for me, going to be Action Packed. A bit of an odder Sloan record. As mentioned earlier, this is the only one where every member of the band didn't write something. There isn't any Andrew songs on here, which is a bit of a shame. Vanessa and I were talking about it a little bit earlier. Andrew is probably my number 1 or my number 2 favorite writer in the group. I think that he is a really interesting one. He's not so clean cut on the pop side in comparison to, say, Patrick. And I don't know, something about Chris, he has like 20 more songs than everybody else, so he's more prone to missing just due to him having more material for me. Where most of Andrew's stuff I think is really strong and it's really interesting. So a bit of a shame that he's not on this one, but it is what it is. At points, this record almost seemed like pop punk to me, which is interesting because I hear this is one of the ones where they were trying to get some crossover appeal at this point outside of Canada, and this is probably the record you could feel that the most upon, having a much heavier, beefier sound, which, as mentioned before on Pretty Together, I don't love, but I think it works a lot better than that one. Starts out all right with Gimme That, and I love the song Live On, although I didn't really like Backstabbing much at all. Probably one of my least favorite Sloan songs. Um, that didn't go over well. It starts a trend for me where like every other song past this point I didn't really like that much. Despite that, I loved Nothing Lasts Forever Anymore, one of my favorite Chris songs. And definitely my favorite on the record. Hollowhead was really cool, and the 2 cuts near the end, Who Loves Life More and Fade Out, were both fairly strong. But I do kind of feel like this is the record where their big crux kind of showcase himself for me. It's that most of their records are fairly inconsistent, which I guess it makes sense given, the 4 different writers and they're all doing their own separate things while still working as a unified group. It kind of naturally just leads to you preferring some writers to others and preferring some people's songs to others. And I feel like the records at points can maybe somewhat come across slightly disjointed, despite me still liking them. I don't know. I like this record. I have it at 3.5 stars, but I do think that this is when some of my more notable flaws was when started to come out. So, number 7, Action Packed, 3.5.
All right. My number 7 is Navy Blues, which is one that also gets very revered here. So this is another instance where I'm going to be going against the grain of my countrymen. But they also played a lot of songs from this album when I saw them a couple weeks ago, because they were supposed to come here for the reunion or for an anniversary tour of the album back in 2020, and it had to get canceled. So they were trying to make up for it while playing a lot from the new album. So, I mean, actually seeing a lot of the songs live brought it up a bit for me, because I had it a bit lower originally. I do think it's kind of an inconsistent album. There is probably their biggest hit on it, which is Money City Maniacs, which like I could sing word for word. Like I've heard it so much, but it's not my favorite because I have heard it so much. It is a solid song, but just heard it too much. But I do think that the album itself is inconsistent. Like there's some really great songs on it. I really like the first three songs. She Says What She Means, Come On, Come On, We're Gonna Get It Started, and Iggy and Argus open the album strong. But then not as big on Sinking Ships, because actually Andrew's probably my least favorite writer overall. But he does have he has some great songs too. I'm not saying that he never has good songs, but he's kind of a little, I don't know, don't always vibe with his writing. And Keep On Thinking is pretty good. And then we get into Money City Maniacs, which of course is the big song. Stand By Me, yeah, is another one that I really like, another highlight for me. And then when we get closer to the end, it comes back up again. Like I Want to Thank You and I'm Not Through With You Yet are two great songs to close out the album. But I did find it disappointing, like you said, after one chord to another. It is quite a downturn. They are kind of leaning into more of those hard rock influences at times, but then they're not at other times. So it's a bit all over the place. And some of the longer songs almost feel longer than they actually are. So that's never a good sign. But I still give it a 4. It's up from a 3.5, because that's where I had it. But I went back to it a couple times, especially after seeing the songs performed live. And I do find with that brought it up a little bit, but definitely not a top 3 Sloan album like I always see it.
Oh yeah, seems like your press has some interesting taste in Sloan, to put it lightly.
Well,
But
that's because that's their biggest period. I think that's a big part of it. That's when they were the most famous. That's when most people have heard the albums, and I think a lot of people lost track of them after a certain point. So,
well, to be fair, both the record before and after it are considerably better than that one. So,
oh
I'm
yeah,
kind of curious where that would rank for you, because Taste Like Music is doing the '98 dive. I don't think I've seen you bring that up for that year, so
purposely because we were
that
doing
that makes sense.
But no,
So,
it's not going to be in my top 25. It's too low of a 4, so
no,
it's not going to make it. But
gotcha. Also, just kind of interesting note to point out. I was watching some of your dad's videos the other day, just because old guys' music and stuff is fun. And Abba Free is a classic, but I saw the CD Finds video where he picked up that record. I'll be curious
yeah,
how he felt on that one. So
I don't know. He never told me actually. That would be his first Sloan album, but I don't know how he felt about it. He hasn't followed up, so
interesting.
that's one I
Uh,
don't have actually.
hmm. Guess we know what you have to do whenever you get back to his house.
Yeah. Well, if he
Uh,
doesn't like it, I'll end up with it. So
Probably. Anyways, at number 6 for me, I'm now talking about Commonwealth. One of the more interesting Sloan records for sure. As we've kind of alluded to, one of the bigger draws to this group is the fact that every member writes and sings on each of the records. It gives them a unique identity, and this is the record that kind of takes the most usage of that. As you've mentioned, each member gets one side of the record. Jay starts out, and because Jay is the best, it is the best side, as you mentioned. I don't think the record actually starts out that strong, weirdly enough, but I like every other song. His side a good bit. Moving on from there, Chris, like I've been saying, I think he's a bit inconsistent, but he has some really good stuff on here. Patrick's side, as I said earlier, I find most of it to be kind of boring, if I'm being brutally honest. Aside from the closing song and his side, What's Inside, I love that one. So some of my favorites on Jay's side, by the way, would be my favorite one on the record, Neither Here Nor There. Chris's would be Carried Away, and Misty's Beside Her. And like I said, Patrick's is What's Inside. But the main draw to this record for me is, as I mentioned before, I really like Andrew and his almost epic of a song at the end of the record. I kind of feel like it touches on pretty much everything that the band was doing. Earlier on in the track, it has that weird. I thought it was almost going to go into like this interesting post rock direction with like the weird, as you mentioned, dog barking and whatnot. And I'm a sucker for that, so I found it really interesting, really engaging. Almost a bit more avant-garde, choosy material, but then you have more of the straight-ahead power pop, a bit of a harder edge rock sound, and as well, the track just has the amazing Beatlesque melodies that they were bringing in and toying with on later records. I'm thoroughly enthused by the full 17 minutes, although I do understand how it wouldn't necessarily play as greatly for you. Although I think it's a pretty impressive feat given the type of band that they are. However, there are some pretty notable holes on the first three sides of the record. So I don't have it higher than 3.5 still, but we're getting to near the end of my 3.5s. So that's how I feel about this one. My favorite track being neither here nor there. And interesting, considering my track record with double records, how both of them ended up in my top half. So maybe I'm not that prejudiced against them after all. So
There you go. Or Sloan's just really good at making them.
hopefully that.
So my number 6 is the latest album, Steady. That one, I think it's a great addition to their discography, especially given that it's their 13th album. It's pretty impressive. They're still kind of working with the formula that they've always had, but there's a lot of solid songs here, and it opens very strong with Magical Thinking, Spend the Day, She Puts Up with What She Puts Down, Human Nature, Scratch the Surface. All those songs, they're very memorable, they're very catchy. Especially Scratch the Surface is the big single, so I hear that one a lot, but I'm still not tired of it, so that's always a good song. And then we get into a little later in the album, we got Dream It All Over Again, Nice Work If You Can Get It, Simply Leaving, All Great, I Dream of Sleep, Keep Your Name Alive. So there's lots of highlights on this album. And I saw, again, like Navy Blues, I saw a lot of these songs performed live, which helps. But I did really like this album when it first came out. And it's still hitting me as a pretty solid album. I know that I think it probably still follows that similar formula as the last few albums before it, but I think that the songs are a little more catchy and more memorable on this one. So I know that they're very proud of it. They kept saying that at the concert. So I think they should be. For a 13th album, 30 years into your career, this can do a lot worse than this. So 4 stars for this one.
Nice. Yeah, I'm not even talking about that one yet. It actually made my top 25 of last year. I was really impressed by it, but last year wasn't great, so it was good. We're talking about a record now that you talked about a good while ago. I'm talking about the Double Cross now. I was a little bit disappointed by Parallel Play, and I feel like this record was a pretty decent bounce back. Just has a lot more personality, in my opinion, a lot more energy, just more pop fun across it. It's also a lot more varied with some almost funky moments across it, as well as a bit of heavier songs, probably the heaviest of such being Traces on the back half, which took me a bit to get into, but I do really like a lot. Follow the Leader is an all right opener, but that's kind of something I need to bring up now. I don't love the way they open a lot of their records. Like, that's kind of something that I picked up on. I feel like they have a really great second song, but some of their first tracks just kind of struggle to get me fully engaged in the record. Which maybe if those were stronger, I could have more fours, but it is what it is. Follow the Leader was an okay opener, as I said, but after that, I really liked The Answer Was You and Unkind. My favorite track here is the Jay song Green Gardens called Montreal. Softer, more somber number. His singing is just beautiful, and to keep it as baseline to describing music as I can, I love the instrument. So, this is the album that made me realize he was probably my favorite member of the band. Him and Andrew, I think Andrew has kind of the more interesting musical direction because he's not so power pop forward and like classic rock influenced. But I feel like Jay is just the most well rounded at doing the pop stuff, at doing sort of the heavier stuff, and just everything else. Plus, his playing is just awesome across these records. With that being said, though, moving forward, another one of my favorites would be Chris's song "Your Daddy Will Do." Maybe my favorite song to have the term "daddy" in the title because I don't like when songs do that. It has almost a slightly funky groove to it, and I really enjoyed it. Overall, it's not a crazy record. It's pretty good, and like most of them, I do think that they're a bit inconsistent. I mean, not really caring for like half the Chris songs and one or two of the Patrick songs mainly. But I think that it has plenty going for it, and it ends up at the top of my 3.5 star records. So moving forward from here, all 4 stars and above. Fours.
Nice. My number 5 is Action Packed. I actually Backstabbing is my favorite song on the album. That's where the album really kicks off for me. Like I just love that one. The first 2 songs are good too, but it's when Backstabbing hits is when I'm like, okay, yeah. So they lead into like a harder rocking sound here, like you said. A little more like Cheap Trick and stuff like that. I think it's a cool sound. I can see where if Andrew's your favorite, it wouldn't work because there's no Andrew here. And I think it's because they had an outside producer come and he selected the songs. I'm pretty sure I was reading. So I think that's why it ended up kind of the way it does. So yeah, it is a little heavy on the Chris and the Patrick. So I can see, and at first that kind of threw me off. But as I listened to it more, I did find that there is some really solid songs on it. And it's actually the action-packed part is actually named after an 80s punk band from Halifax song. They had a song called Youth Action Packed. The band's called Jellyfish Babies, and they're pretty notorious on the scene of like kicking off cooler music coming from Halifax. So that's pretty neat. Bit of a callback. The Rest of My Life was the big hit from this album, and I don't know, it's a funny song because not only does it kind of seem a little out of place on this album, it just doesn't almost even sound like them to me. Like for the longest time when it was first a single, I didn't actually even realize it was them. So it is a funny, but it's a good song. I do like it. False Alarm by Jay it's a nice change on the album. Really like that one. And Nothing Lasts Forever Anymore is a great song. Really like that one too. And Who Loves Life More, Fade Away. Those are 2 other highlights. But yeah, I think it's just a solid album. I like that they're doing a bit of a different sound on it. And it did go up for me as I was listening to a couple of these albums more. So here it is at number 5 for 4 stars.
Nice. Yeah, I like that one a little bit more than me, but I don't know. I just kind of like having the variety that I think that Andrew brings. But Jay typically is also very good in that regard, so it is what it is. Number 4
Yeah.
for me, maybe a bit high for some people, but I have the new one. I have Steady. Yeah, this is one of the first Sloan records I'd heard in full, and maybe I have a certain connection to it due to that. But for me, this is pretty easily their best set of songs since never hear the end of it. Like I was mentioning before, I don't love the opener, Magical Thinking. I think that's good, but I feel like on this record especially, I feel like there's a weird dichotomy with Chris's songs. Like I really like half of them, and I just don't really find the other half that good, which I know I've said before, but on this record I mean it. So after that, I think there's a great string of songs. Spend the Day is really good. She Put Up What You Put Down. And I absolutely love the song Human Nature. It's probably in my top 5 just Chris songs in general. I think that one is just beautiful. I love the like orchestral elements in the back half of it. Wish that they played with that a bit more because it really works well for them. After that, there's some great songs near the end. Andrew has a really cool song with Close Encounters. It doesn't really sound like the rest of the record, but I think that it blends in pretty well. And my favorite on here is the closer, Keep Your Name Alive by Joe, which is about what you would expect at this point. I won't try and claim that this is like an amazing album by any means. I just think that it's really well rounded and across the board has some really strong material on it. 4 stars for me. It's really good. Steady.
They actually opened the concert with Magical Thinking, and it was kick-ass as a concert opener, I will say. So
That makes sense. I
yeah.
do think that it starts out with a good energy to the record. I just don't love the song. So
Yeah. That seems to be one a lot of people were mixed on, but I really like that one.
thanks.
So my number 4 is one that you don't like very much at all. Pretty Together. I just think like this cover is like the perfect cover for this album. It's got like a lot of sunny vibes for me. And but it is funny. It is kind of a random number 4. Like when I was looking back at my list last night, I was like, is that really my number 4? Like, that seems like such a random one to be there. So I re-listened to it again today, and I was like, no, it is. I just think it's a really solid album, really sunny, kind of power poppy vibe a lot of the time, but they've got some different stuff on there too. Um, if It Feels Good, Do It is the opener, and that was a big song. Probably not my favorite, never been my favorite of their singles, but it's still a good song. But The Other Man, love that one way more. And that it's actually probably an even bigger song. That's one you still hear a lot. Really like In the Movies. This is a case where I really like one of Andrew's songs. So he's kind of back and forth for me. It's not that I don't like him, but if I'm to not like a song as much, it's usually going to be one of his. Really like Dreaming of You, pick it up and dial it. The Life of a Working Girl, love that one. Who You Talking To, I Love a Long Goodbye, Are You Giving Me Back My Love? So yeah, there's a lot of highlights on this album for me. And I just think that it's a solid album in their discography, but it leans more into that poppy sound. So that makes sense that if you're not as into that it wouldn't connect as much. So, and I still think, yeah, like obviously Between the Bridges is a stronger album. I haven't talked about it yet. So yeah.
Interesting. We have the same top three, which I kind of expected going into this. So
Yeah.
I feel like they kind of have like a definitive top three. And I think we're going to be in agreement on it. I could be wrong, but we'll see. Number three for me, I have Never Hear the End of It. I think that this is a bit of a challenging record compared to what came before it, being the first of Sloan's two double records, is all having 30 songs to it. And it still doesn't cross over the 80-minute mark, which is really cool to hear. Largely due in part to one of my bigger just pet peeves in music, which I've talked about again and again. I just don't like when albums are flooded with a bunch of like really short songs. I'd rather it be, like 18 songs and just add an extra minute to bulk up some of these other ones as opposed to having the little snippets. It's just a personal thing for me. This doesn't necessarily connect as well. It's harder for me to sink my teeth into some of those songs. But most of the time they're good. They skate by and sort of blend into each other. So I think that they work fine on this record. They're just fun little power pop songs one at a time. Despite that, pretty much every song that exceeds around 2.5 minutes I think is great. Who Taught You to Live Like That is awesome. Everybody Wants You is really strong. I loved Anna Lucia this time. Live the Life You're Dreaming. And I Know You are also one of my favorite Sloan songs. And this album actually does have my favorite Sloan song, being a Chris song, surprisingly enough. Being the track Fading into Obscurity. I've always just loved that song every time. So that's the song that really got me hooked on them, I would say. But once again, I feel like me just not loving power pop as a whole does hurt this album. It's over 15 minutes of power pop, and it just grows to be a bit tiring overall. So despite it being really good, I just wish it was a bit shorter for my own personal taste. I have it at a solid 4 stars. It's really good. Just was never gonna be my favorite due to the length. So
Well, our order is going to be different. But
it
so
is
my
what it
last
is.
album was 4 stars. I didn't actually give a rating for it, but it's the last of my 4 stars. So my number 3 is Between the Bridges, which is a great album, obviously. And it's a very Halifax album. There's a lot of references to things about Halifax. Well, Between the Bridges, the title itself is a Halifax reference. We have two big bridges that go from the Halifax to the Dartmouth side, and a lot of stuff happens in the core of the city between the two bridges. So that's kind of where that comes from. And there's a lot about it that is an extra touch that makes it a little more special, but the songs are also really great even if you don't have that connection. It opens with the NS, which is probably one of my favorite Andrew songs. Very like I'd always take it as kind of about them leaving Nova Scotia, because just before this album I think that's when they permanently changed their base to Toronto and left Nova Scotia as their home base permanently. So there's probably a lot of conflicting feelings about that. And that's kind of how I take that song. Like, it's got a very wistful sort of tone to it. And it also goes back to Andrew often writes songs about like the ocean and like going to sea, which makes sense being from here. We're surrounded by ocean. It's very much part of our culture. So that's just always something interesting I found about his writing. And then it goes right into So Beyond Me, which is a Chris song, and that's a fun power pop song. Quite a big difference from the NS, but I think it works. I think they transition well. And then after that, basically every song I have highlighted as a favorite. I have Friendships, So Beyond Me, Don't You Believe a Word, all great songs. Waiting for Slow Songs is probably one of my absolute favorites. Just love that one. I've been listening to that one a lot, just outside of the album as well. One of my favorite, it's just ones I never really, not I'd heard it before, but it just really connected for me this time. So I really love going back to that one. Losing California is the big hit. That one I already knew. That was a pretty big song. And they played that at the show. And they also played The Marquee and the Moon, because that's another one that's very Halifax. It's about the two very big music venues from when they were coming up as a band. So the Misty Moon was a big bar here from the late 60s to the early 90s. And they probably went there as young people and saw bands and maybe played there themselves. And then the Marquee came a little bit later and still exists, actually. And that was kind of like the cool new venue. And I take this song as being about like the passing of the torch from like the older bands to the younger scene. And that's just a really cool song. And they played that, of course, at the show because it's just a kind of a special Halifax song. And Take Care of the Poor Boy, that's another great one, another Jay song. So yeah, I think this is a very strong album from beginning to end. It's a 4.5 for me. It's not quite to the level of my top two, but I still love it. Like, it's definitely one that's gone up in my estimation in this listen. So that was a pleasant surprise.
Bit of a shame. Bit of a shame. Thought we were going to agree. But anyways. I'll be honest, I thought that song was just like gonna be television or whatever because Marky Moon. I just kind of what my mind immediately went to, but
Well,
good
someone on Genius thought it was about drugs. I read this big, like, I went on Genius because the first time I heard it, I was like, this is obviously about Halifax bars. And then I look at this and they're like, well, this is about heroin. I'm like, what the hell are you talking about? No, it's not.
Well, they're clearly
And they
not
even said at
Canadian.
the show it was about, obviously, about the Misty Moon and the Marquee. So
That's funny. Well, unfortunately, my number two is going to be One Chord to Another. It is what it is. Well, the band definitely did toy closer with the power pop sound on Twice Removed. One Chord to Another is when they start to fully embrace it. Everything here has a much tighter sheen, and there is a lot of distortion and a lot of the distortion and the heavier moments that were found on the previous record are mostly gone here. Probably my favorite moment on this record, interestingly enough, is the backing vocals. Not totally sure if they were on the first two. I know that you've mentioned the female backing vocals, but I more so mean like the band backing vocals. And I really feel like they elevate the songs that they feature on here. As well, I just think that the songs are a lot more memorable. There's much stronger hooks, tighter playing overall as a group, and I found myself actually gravitating weirdly enough to the Patrick songs on this record, which I haven't talked about Patrick as much here because he exists. He's kind of like the most in the middle for me a lot of the time. He has good songs, but rarely does he ever put out like my favorites. And as you mentioned before, he does kind of rewrite a lot of his similar songs. He's definitely the one that's the most overtly inspired by the power pop, and he sticks pretty true to that. And he's good at it, so I don't fault him for it. I just wish maybe there was a bit more variance in what he did. Although he has probably my favorite voice of the group, just a powerhouse singer. Moving from there, my favorite track was Everything That You've Done Wrong, which is, in my opinion, their best written and performed song up to that point. Chris Murphy's Nothing Left to Make Me Want to Say is great as well as Jay Ferguson's Junior Panthers is very strong. Admittedly, there is a bit of a lull in the second half, but it closes pretty strong with Can't Face Up and 400 Meters. It's a very strong crop of material overall that does show that Sloan are a band that is growing record by record. It is still a little flawed for me, though. There are a couple of songs that, to me, just don't quite connect. It's a pretty high 4 stars. I think that it's very good, but it's not quite great, unlike my number one, which I do get up to 4.5 stars with this band. So worth it for that alone.
well, we agree on a placement. So One Chord to Another is my number 2, which it was actually my assumed number 1. I assumed all along it would be my number 1 because it's the one I've known the best, longest. And I think it's where everything definitely comes together for them. It's the first, when I first got introduced to them, with The Good in Everyone, which is one of my favorite of their songs. Like, I absolutely just love that burst of energy, and it never gets old. I've heard it millions of times, and like, I just love it. But also, Everything You've Done Wrong is the other big single, and that is just a masterpiece too. That's another one that just never gets old. But there's a lot of other masterpieces on this album. Like, I pretty well love every song. It's another one where it's like highlight, 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 highlight. So like Nothing Left to Make Me Want to Stay, Autobiography, Junior Panthers, G Turns to D, A Sides Win. Like that whole first side, fantastic. The second side is also fantastic. There's a couple that I don't have down as highlights, but they're still great. Like Anyone Who's Anyone and 400 Meters the Closer, probably my 2 least favorite, but even then, I mean, they're still great songs. It's like, that's just being nitpicky at that point, really. The Lines You Amend is probably my favorite on the second side, I would say. Oh, well, other than Everything You've Done Wrong, but yeah. And Take It to the Bench, or Take the Bench. That's another great one. Love that one. But yeah, like you said, it's where everything comes together, where they become Sloan. And I think a big part of that is it's their first independent album after leaving Geffen. So they were actually able to do what they wanted to do, because I think the first 2 albums on Geffen, they had a lot of pressure to fit into that more 90s sound. And I don't think it's necessarily what they wanted to do. So I think that is where we see the difference in the sound of their music, and that they're actually writing the songs that they wanted to write. They wanted to lean more into that poppy sound, I think. And I just think every song here is strong. It's all killer, no filler, basically. Great album. It's where all their unique identities are there, but they all fit together so well, so cohesively. And you wouldn't necessarily know on the surface that it's 4 different people writing the songs, but I think it just works fabulously. Whereas it doesn't always flow together that way on other albums. So for me, it's a 5. So they have 2 5-star albums for me. But yeah, my number 2, one chord to another.
Yeah, I won't lie. I had you pegged down for that being number 1 almost definitely.
Me too.
I definitely expected it to be one of this or my number 1, but it is what it is. And also, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'm insane. Probably am, given some of the stuff that I've said on this channel. But looking at it, the 3 songs that I didn't love on one chord to another were Anyone Who's Anyone, The Lines You Amend, and Take the Bench. I don't know. Maybe it's just me instinctively knowing this is what's popular, so I gotta hate it. So it is what it is.
I don't know that any of those were really big. Only The Lines You Amend is like a fan favorite one.
I thought you said Anyone Was Anyone.
They actually played that in the encore at the show. I don't know if it was a single though, but like it's just one that's become one that people love. But the other 2, they're just album tracks. The 2 big hits were The Good in Everyone and Everything You've Done Wrong are the 2 major in this album.
The Lines You Amend was the 3rd single.
Oh, okay, so it was a single. You just don't hear it as much though, like
Makes
on the
radio. It was the 3rd one, so yeah, sounds about right. Imagine getting a 3rd single for your record. Crazy. But anyway, my number 1, pretty clearly, because I have 1 record left. Between the Bridges. This album caught me off guard a little bit. Well, I knew I enjoyed plenty of Sloan work before this. This is where I think that the band really fully finds itself, drawing mainly from 70s pop and hard rock elements, in addition to the already killer power pop sound they were using to create a really just interesting sound that plays brilliantly into all of their vocals and lyrics. I just think pretty much track to track, this album is just sensational. It's easier to list the tracks that I didn't like as opposed to the ones that I do. My least favorite track is by Jay with Take Care of the Boy. But everything else here is just really excellent. My favorites were Waiting for Slow Songs by Jay, The Marquee and the Moon, as well as Sensory Deprivation. I have little bad to say about this project as a whole. It's just pure power pop bliss, and I really can't recommend it enough. Depending on what you would call power pop as a whole, this could be my number 1 just like straight power pop record. Because you have something like the Cars or Parallel Lines, which I like way more. But to be fair, those definitely veer into new wave and like disco and whatnot. So kind of hard to call them like strictly power pop. But if I'm going for just like a pure power pop record, this is probably my number one. I've got 4.5 stars. I think it's a great record, Between the Bridges.
My number one shocked the hell out of me. I knew that people liked it, and I knew I was going to like it. I even bought it before I heard it because they were selling them at the show. So never hear the end of it. But when I put that on, holy shit, I will say, like, it just floored me. Like, I hated that I couldn't talk about it. Like, I was so excited after hearing this album. Like, I just wanted to talk about it, but I couldn't because, I mean, obviously, I was keeping it under wraps for this episode. But oh my gosh, like, how do they do it? A double album, 30 songs, and they're all killer. Like, it's just bang, 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 bang. And like, every song, I just love it. And see, to me, those little short songs, I don't mind those because they feel like such complete songs in that little bit of amount of time. The way that they make them into these complete pop songs that are satisfying, that feel like they could have been 3 minutes because they get you where you want to go, but they're so short. Like, that's just amazing. And this is some of Andrew's best writing, I think, that I've seen, that I like overall. Like, I like more of his songs on this album than any other album, but I like basically almost every song on this album. Like, actually, no, I do, because like I can't even pick one that I wouldn't like. And it's just highlight after highlight. Like, they don't even let you breathe, but it's okay. You just love it. Like, it's just, I can't even believe that it's an hour and 16 minutes. Like, it goes by so fast. And I've listened to it a few times now, and like every time I'm just like right into it the entire time. They did perform HFX NSHC at the show, and it was so awesome. Like, Patrick got right into like the full punk mode, and it was just like, it was so great. And they also did Who Taught You to Live Like That, which was also really awesome to see. But yeah, just about, I don't even know, like, Fading into Obscurity, you mentioned that one, and that one is really great. I love that one. Yeah, I don't know. I can't even give you highlights because there's 30 great songs. I just sit here and list 30 songs. Like, this was just the most exciting revelation for me of this. Like, I wasn't expecting to love it this much. So I was so happy to find it and actually finally listen to it. So it's definitely a 5-star album for me for this one.
Was not expecting you to go that way. Like I said, I thought you were locked up for One Chord to Another. But,
so did I, though. I wasn't expecting it either. Like, I thought, oh yes, I know my number one. The rest will kind of come together. But yeah,
kind of curious how high that would play for you in 06 now, because that was Jason's number one for 06, and
how was it?
by spoiler alert, his Sloan list as well. So
yeah.
But yeah, I think it's really strong. I can't fault you for that. I mean, it's 30, as you said, really good songs. It's just like a personal thing as to why I can never love that record as much as there are others.
Yeah. See, and like those short songs, as long as a short song is a complete song, like feels like a song, I'm okay with it. But I mean, I also love someone like the Minutemen, who their whole thing is short songs. Like, they don't have, I think they might have a couple songs at 4 minutes. Like, that's like in their whole discography. So, and Guided by Voices too. So this doesn't phase me to have short songs, and I think they just do it amazingly here. They're not fragments, they're songs. Like, and that's so hard to do. Like, so
for sure. Yeah, this was a fun one. 13 records, nothing really overtly bad in the catalog. Everything is, at least there's a good song in every one of these records.
Yeah.
And it's just really interesting because this is definitely one of those bands that got nothing really outside of Canada.
Right.
Which is weird. It's like a Tragically Hip situation if they were good. It's like
yeah. But both are getting their resurgence online now, which is outside of Canada, which is interesting to see as a Canadian. Like, to see people from outside of Canada loving Sloan and knowing about Sloan is kind of weird, but it's cool. Like, you love to see it, but because they're kind of underappreciated here because they have so many hits, but a lot of people kind of either take them for granted or like, Sloan, whatever, you know, especially where I am. Like, people either like love them because they're the hometown boys, or they're just like, ugh, whatever, Sloan, they're
I'm,
from hell, So it's nice to see some enthusiasm for them online. I mean,
absolutely.
it's cool to see enthusiasm for the Tragically Hip too, but I don't love the Tragically Hip, so I don't care.
Yeah. I mean,
But I also hear a lot more of the Tragically Hip against my will than I ever have heard.
yeah.
So that
Well, I
makes me
mean, I don't know. Tragically Hip are fine. I like some of their stuff, but song of singers that aren't just trying to be Michael Stipe. So I mean, that works for me. So I don't know.
Yeah, they all have good, unique voices in Sloan. So that
Absolutely,
helps.
absolutely. With that being said, however, it was nice to get you on an episode for an artist that actually kind of knew stuff going into. Because Fiona Apple was most definitely not much the case. Dinosaur Jr. was better than that. But this is like the first time I invited you for an artist that actually kind of made sense to invite you for. So that was good.
Oh, I loved having to going through Dinosaur Jr.
Oh
That
yeah,
was, and I already knew some Dinosaur Jr. I was happy, and I knew some Fiona Apple too, but she just,
yeah, yeah. I mean, hey, you're still better about Fetch the Bolt Cutters than say like Andre is. So
yeah, no
you
offense
know,
to the others is good enough. Yeah.
yeah, I love it. But anyways, I look at my schedule. I forgot which one is after this. That's the issue with recording as many of these episodes as I have. I just don't remember which ones I'm
Well,
doing
yeah,
next.
no, that
Well,
makes sense.
alrighty. Following this, we're doing a solo episode. Not we. I'm doing a solo episode tackling the 7 albums of folk rock, Americana, alt country group Dawes. For people who know them, pretty much worship at the feet of the band, but most people don't know them. So that'll be interesting to talk about. Their record from last year, if you don't actually know, was my album of the year. So I think very highly of them. And yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm most of the way through that catalog now, so hoping I can get that recorded by the end of the week, actually. So we'll see how that goes. That being said, that was Sloan. I hope that you give these guys a listen, especially if you aren't Canadian and aren't bombarded by them in Halifax. Only 13 records and they're all enjoyable. So, that being said, I really hope that you enjoyed. I hope that you check out more stuff. In the description below, there's going to be a Discord so you can tell me how badly I messed up this group and how Vanessa was correct about the Canadian press being wrong.
I have a feeling I'm going to be the most wrong, but that's
Eh,
okay.
it's fine. It's fine. You didn't have anything too out of the ordinary. It's like,
Uh, my list was pretty off from the list that I've seen.
well,
Like,
the lists that you've seen are probably wrong, so it's okay.
yeah, well, I don't care, but yeah.
Yeah. That being said, that was Sloan. I really hope that you enjoyed and hope that you'll join again for Dawes. That being said, you have a great one.